In a lot of my books, I try and get under history. I try and see what really happened. We're kind of living in an age where a lot of mythology is being torn down, statues are being torn down, and people sort of want to know what really happened. So that's sort of the basic premise I take with all my books, and especially this title, Greed in the Gilded Age, which is just a fascinating story, which I don't know if any of you have seen Inventing Anna on Netflix, but or The Gilded Age. This very much mirrors what happened, and as far as Inventing Anna, which we're going to have a little clip from here, this woman did it 100 years before. So it's a fascinating story of the Gilded Age. We're going to talk a lot about that. So why don't we start with this little clip from World News Tonight. We'll give you a little taste of what I write, how I write, and Titanic.
Whatever you think you know about the Titanic, I'm the king of the world! Think again.
Everyone could have been saved on Titanic if it were not for human failing.
On the 110th anniversary of its sinking, a new book says that all of those lives lost could have been spared.
What I uncovered was the fact that, these two ships one was about 5 miles away, one was 10 miles, and that in fact they could have come in and rescued these people, and they did not.
Author William Hazelgrove diving into the research.
All these passengers who got off to California and the Mount Temple, they all talked to different newspapers, different reporters in Canada and the United States, and they all said the same thing. They said, we saw the ship. It was right there.
The RMS Californian, commanded by Captain Stanley Lord.
And he says, no, that's a Russian fishing trawler, and we aren't going in.
His crew watching as the Titanic sent up rockets in distress, all within just miles.
Captain Smith is on board the Titanic telling the people in the boat, see that light, row toward that light.
Why is this the first that I'm hearing that everybody could have survived?
Well, history's written by the victors.
In this case, it's 1955's A Night to Remember by Walter Lord and the 1958 movie by the same name.
Iceberg, get ahead, sir!
But the truth, according to Hazelgrove, is that Captain Lord and Captain James Henry Moore of the Temple, also nearby, could have rescued the 1,500 people who lost their lives so many years ago today. Here in New York City, this park is dedicated to Ida and Isidore Strauss. Ida was offered a spot on lifeboat number 8 but declined to get on board, wanting to stay by her husband's side. Now, all these years later, the legend of the Titanic endures.
And maybe in those wireless coils, down on the bottom of the ocean, when they pull it up, there'll be one last message embedded in there. And you can bet it's probably that universal question that we still ask today, especially today, will you come help us?
Captain Lord of the RMS Californian was later found guilty in British and American inquiries of not going to rescue a ship in distress, and he was disgraced, stripped of his titles. You can find 160 Minutes, The Race to Save the RMS Titanic, anywhere books are sold.
Will they ever find the heart of the ocean, or?
It's been 87 years.
Does he have any theories?
84 years. I mean, this was a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to read this book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, in all seriousness, this was, the worst maritime disaster, especially at the time, ever.
Yeah.
Oh.
I have
Jack
a child.
and Rose.
Billy Zane.
Billy Zane.
Okay, but we're here to talk about this, but that gives you a little flavor of sort of the approach I take to books. Andrew Carnegie, Cassie Chadwick, Elizabeth Bigley, we're going to jump into this right now. But these two people we brought together and face each other in open court in a real Gilded Age tale where she actually claims she's the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie and reaps incredible benefits. It is a Gatsby-esque tale. I mean, we're all sort of familiar with Gatsby. You can see I wrote a book on actually the writing of Gatsby, in that it seems like there's easy money out there. That's what the Gilded Age is all about. People believe there's a pot of gold over the next hill. And this is behind a lot of these scandals of the Gilded Age. So that's the setup for this. This is Cassie Chadwick. She was known as the Queen of Diamonds because she literally would go into jewelry stores and clean them out, buy everything she could. And then when she would meet people in New York, she lined her room, her hotel room, with diamonds all on the walls. She literally was weighed down with all this jewelry. And yet this woman is nothing what she appears to be. And she's going to reach out and connect herself to this man, the richest man in America, incredibly, by throwing out this knowledge that she is the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. And they will face each other down in the trial of the century. And I wrote this book from all newspaper accounts because there was nothing on it before. And the newspaper accounts really are fascinating because it's a you are there feeling on all of them. And this trial was so popular, it knocked the inauguration of Teddy Roosevelt off the front page. And again, this is a little still from the Gilded Age that is playing now, but it's still fascinating because we are in a second Gilded Age right now. And by the way, the Gilded Age is really 1865, and I date it to 1912, April 14th, 1912, when the Titanic sunk. I think those are two good bookends right there. So after the Civil War, we start to become a nation of cities. Before the Civil War, we're an agrarian country. And as that little piece said, 400 families own all the wealth. All right, in America, really before the Civil War, it wasn't like that. We didn't have all this concentrated wealth. We had never seen that before. But this came about because during the war, we laid all these tracks to move troops all over the country. So the United States was coast to coast at this point, where we brought these tracks as far as we could go. Well, then after the Civil War, this was a method to bring goods to market. So a national market started to develop. So before this, you would take your crops into town and sell them locally. After the national market started to emerge, your crops were shipped off, a price was set in Chicago, and they were sold to people you never saw. So this is the beginning of people beginning to be disconnected from the way they make money. If you were a shoe cobbler or whatever, your shoes now were being having a competitive edge from Sears, who was sending out catalogs there right where you could actually, order some shoes. And as we become more and more urban, people start to go to cities to get employment. And this brings up a really fascinating phenomenon, where people start selling their labor for money. We're used to this. We're used to getting paid. Most of us, we don't get paid by the hour. Some do. But this was a new concept where you were selling your time. You were saying, my time's worth this. And so all these people going into work into the mills and factories that are transforming America, these people are now essentially becoming wage slaves because the market is setting what they'll pay them for their labor, which again is a new phenomenon. But let's go back in time here and let's talk about Cassie, because this is what she's going to come into. Her real name's Elizabeth Bigley, all right? She lives in Canada with her parents, and they're not poor, but they don't have much money. Her father works for the railroad. And she's always seeing these trains go steaming by, and as a child, she's very enamored with the idea of wealth, with having fine clothes, with going to fine restaurants. She's a little different. She's deaf in one ear, and she goes into what later people call spells, where suddenly it was like she wasn't there, and she'd just be staring into space, and then she would come back. She was also known to have these sort of hypnotic eyes, people claim later. She had this way of looking at you where she just pulled you in. Very young, she pulls her first con. Basically what she does is she prints up a card saying she's an heiress going to inherit $15,000. Now this is a time when bankers lent on perceived wealth. Now we've gone for a loan, we have our FICOs, we have references, we have to have our checking account, they have to track our money, and even then they might not give it to us. Here, you went in, and if they thought you had money, the banker could make a decision on the spot and lend it to you. Also, one of the norms of lending then was kickbacks. You were expected to kick back to the banker some of the money. Okay, so Cassie Chadwick gets a dress, one of her mother's dresses, mends up some shoes, makes her own hat, and at this time she's about 20, and she is an attractive woman, young woman, and she goes into a bank, a local bank, and she presents this card that she had printed up saying, I'm going to inherit $15,000. And she's very beguiling. She has these sort of small animal teeth. She has a sort of wispy voice. And she talks to these bankers, and she walks out with a line of credit. Goes all over the town in Canada and basically lives it up. Buys clothes, goes to hotels, eats in restaurants. Well, they finally catch up with her when they realize there is no money, and she's put on trial. She acts crazy, just out of her mind. And the judge says, tell you what, I won't put you in jail, but you've got to go. You've got to leave. And so what'd she do? She goes to stay with her sister in Cleveland, Ohio, which is just fine with her because in her mind, America is lined with gold. This is the Gilded Age. This is a place where you can become rich overnight. 2 new terms came about during this time: millionaire and conspicuous consumption, because they had to describe the way people were spending money in ways that nobody had ever seen. And when Cassie arrives with her sister is married. She thinks this pot of gold is over the next hill. So she behaves herself for a little bit, but quickly she becomes Miss Bastato. And Miss Bastato, and by the way, you can change your identity at this time at will. There is no social security numbers. There's nobody tracking you. They have no way to know. So if you want to become somebody else, you change your name. And that's about it. She changed her name to Miss Bastato. And she became the heiress, the Irish heiress. And she started going to banks and getting money at exorbitant interest rates. And she keeps this up, hopscotching from one bank to another. Well, at a point, the banks start going, we need some collateral. So she says, well, I can offer you my furniture, my home. So she hawks her sister's furniture, all right, puts it against these loans. Everything's going well until the bankers show up at her house one night, and her sister's husband's home. And they say, listen, we've come to repossess this furniture. He goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, this has been hocked to all these loans. They throw her out. Her sister Alice comes home. There's a big confrontation, and they throw Cassie out of their home. Now, Cassie is nothing if not resourceful. She rolls around, still using the Miss Bastato sort of covert, and she bumps into a man named Dr. Springsteen. Again, she's an attractive woman, and she marries Dr. Springsteen. But while they're getting married, or while they're waiting to get married, she spends his money and goes all over town again, just buying things, buying jewelry, all this stuff. And on their wedding night, the creditors show up, and they say, we need to get paid. We haven't been paid. You spent all this money. And her husband's like, what are you talking about? He does a quick investigation and realizes she's a con and throws her out. But that doesn't stop her, actually. She goes to another town and tries to pull $6,000 on him again, except they stop her before she can do that. Now Cassie, again, she's back on her own, so what does she do? What anybody would do in this situation? She changes her name again. She is now Madame Devore. Okay, and Madame Devore is, again, an heiress who's going to inherit money, and she goes around trying to get as much as she can, but she's having trouble now because people are on to her. But fate comes in, and she marries a farmer named C.L. Hoover. And C.L. Hoover, again, buys into the whole thing of she's got this money in Ireland and all this, and C.L. Hoover mysteriously dies, but she does have a son with him. And she goes back to her sister's home, but now she has some money because Hoover left her some money, and she goes back to her sister's home and makes peace. Now, again, she starts to run through the money, and she has to come up with another way to make it. And so Madame Devore now becomes a spiritualist. This is at a time when science is moving in. America was very, very religious in the 19th century, very close to God. When in the 20th century, all this secularism was moving in, all this materialism. People were adrift, so they wanted to talk to dead, to past loved ones. They wanted to talk to the other world, the underworld, and so Madame Devore would provide that service. She also provided other services we aren't quite sure on the side, There might be a little prostitution at this time. Now, as all great con artists eventually do, she got conned herself. A gentleman approached her and said, listen, I'm trying to get money from this insurance company. Could you impersonate this person for me? I need you to impersonate this woman, and I'll cut you in on it. Cassie does. The con blows up, and he says it was all her idea. She's left holding the bag and goes to prison. Sentenced to 9 years in prison for this. All right. So she gets swindled at this point. Now, prison's hellish for her. She works in the dress shop. She loses weight, but she starts to plan her revenge. And she perceives getting this sentence of 9.5 years here. And by the way, they still don't know who she is. They have her as Madame Devori. All right, so even in prison, they have no idea that her real name is Elizabeth Bigley. But she starts to plot a revenge because she feels like men did this to her. And she wants to get back at the biggest man in America, this guy. Okay, Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie's trail is not that different. He comes to America, this young Scottish boy, works his way up to the railroads, but the way he makes his money is because he's working in the telegraph office, he gets inside information on stocks. And so he buys stocks. And today it would be illegal, but then it's not. And he was amazed that he could get a dividend for doing nothing. And so he starts to build his wealth this way. He starts to build it through all this inside information and these stocks, and then he meets other brokers who give more inside information. He builds it and builds it. And then he realizes, you know what? The United States is building railroads all over the country. And he buys a steel mill, and he gets another one, another, and he starts to sell all this steel to the United States and to these big railroads. And he becomes immensely, immensely wealthy. Now, he's a young guy. He's in his 30s, and he's thinking, how did I get all this money when so many others have nothing? And so, by the way, Andrew Carnegie did not believe in hard work. In fact, he only worked 3 hours a day at best, okay? So it wasn't that. So he wanted to find out what was the secret, what was the reason he got it. So he took a year, he read up, did a lot of research, and he came up with a book called Gospel of Wealth. And basically he said, it's not hard work, not because I'm smarter than anybody else. He said it was circumstance, that people get this money when so many others have nothing, because they're at the right place at the right time. And for him, he was at a point where the United States was expanding, these railroads were building up, and he could manufacture the steel. So for him, it was circumstance. And he said, then it becomes your responsibility to eventually give this money back or give this wealth back to the people, because you're now a custodian. So it's a little Darwinistic. He's saying, I am the person who has this, and so I am the anointed in that way. So it's up to me to give it back. But he basically says, it sure isn't hard work. Now, back to Cassie. Cassie opens a massage parlor, okay, where she does all sorts of things. And she tells fortunes and all sorts of things. But she is actually a massage therapist, we would call physical trainer today. It's a guy named Dr. Chadwick. And Dr. Chadwick is a renowned physician on Cleveland's Millionaire Row, which is where all the rich people live. And Chadwick has a daughter, his wife has died, and a mother living with him. And he lives in a big mansion. But he suffers badly from rheumatism, arthritis. And so he seeks out a remedy, and he ends up visiting her, all right? And he visits Madame Devori. And she helps him with his arthritis, and he becomes very enamored with her. She is now, since she's gotten out of prison, she's gained back all her weight, she's very alluring, and Chadwick is taken with her, and she uses the old Irish heiress stuff on him, and he's looking for somebody to run his house, and so they get married. And she ends up on Millionaire's Row. So think about this. Before she was in jail, serving her sentence, I think she did about 7 years. Now she's married to Dr. Chadwick, who has servants, has a car, right? who has lots of money, and she's in a big mansion. In fact, she throws a big party for all the other people on Millionaires Row, all right, as she starts to spend his fortune. And they all come, and it's just lavish as lavish. But they're all like, she's a little strange. The way she speaks and the way she looks, someone thought she was insane. And they don't want to come back to her house. And Cassie very much feels this slight and feels like the only way you can overcome this feeling that you're not as good as other people, that maybe you are just a poor person, is to keep accumulating, keep spending. And so she does. She goes out, and again, this is when she starts cleaning out jewelry stores. She goes to Europe. She buys all these grand pianos, gives them to people, just spends, and she redoes his house several times. Chadwick is getting very, very alarmed. But this is a time when you didn't confront your wife. And he starts to secretly move money over to Europe because he's thinking, I'm going to be broke soon, right? And he then decides, I've had enough of this, and he takes his daughter to Europe with the intention of not coming back, leaving Cassie on her own. Now, this is where Cassie, and most people would be okay with having this big house, having these servants, all this, but not Cassie. This is when Cassie decides to make her move. And this is her biggest con yet. So she goes to New York. She meets a guy named John Dillon, who's a lawyer. And he's a financial lawyer. And she says, can you meet me at the train station when I come in? She had met him through her husband. He says, sure. So she picks him up. She goes, I need you to take me to my father's house. He goes, okay. So they go along through Newark, go to Fifth Avenue, and they stop here in Andrew Carnegie's mansion. And Dillon's jaw drops and she goes, I'll be right back. So she goes up to the door and disappears into the mansion while Dillon just sits there waiting. And she talks to a maid, all right? And she kills time, saying she's checking references for some servants. And then she comes back out to the carriage, or Dillon still is staring at her, and she drops a note on the floor of the carriage. Dillon picks it up. And it's a trust agreement. And it basically says that she's going to inherit the Carnegie millions. And Dillon stares at her and she goes, oh, I've got to tell you this terrible story. I'm the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. He's been paying me for years to keep me quiet. And, he's now starting to get really tight, and so I'm having to come to see him. She says, but don't tell anybody. Of course, Dillon says, I will never tell anybody, and then runs off and tells everybody, right? Because he's plugged in the financial market. So all these financial markets in New York, Cleveland, start to understand that, in fact, the Carnegie millionaires are going to this woman named Cassie Chadwick. But she's not done. She goes and sees a guy named Ira Reynolds at the Wade Park Bank. And she comes in with a package, and it's bound up. And she says, listen, I need a line of credit. There's $5 million in securities in here, and I've got to tell you a story. So she tells him the same story of being the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. And he says, well, okay, but I should probably open this package and see what's in it. And she says, you doubt the word of a lady? And Ira Reynolds says, oh, absolutely not. And he takes it and puts it in the vault and gives her a line of credit on that $5 million. So then she goes and sees a guy named C.T. Beckworth. And she's starting to triangulate. This is the brilliance of Cassie Chadwick. She goes to see a guy named C.T. Beckworth. C.T. Beckworth has the Oberlin Bank. Oberlin Bank, C.T. Beckworth is that classic 19th century banker. Very staid, has a big family in Cleveland. He brings in his investors. He knows all the people invest, walks to the bank every day with a cane, nodding to people. But one night, she goes to see C.T. Beckworth. There's a guy named Teller Spears who's with Beckworth. And she sits down and says, listen, I've got a story to tell you. And so she tells him the story of being the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. And she says, I'm going to inherit all this money and I need somewhere to put it. And I'm thinking about your bank. At this point, Beckworth is a little skeptical. He's like, well, okay. And she says, of course, I do have other references, and I have a line of credit from Ira Reynolds Bank, the Wade Park Bank. And she shows it to him. Well, then he says, okay. And she says, you know, but my father's being very tight right now, and I just need some small cash to tide me over till I get this big inheritance. And he says, well, how much you need? Well, $20,000. And he says, I'm your man. So Beckworth. Now remember, this is a bank that there's no FDIC. It's only floats on the investors being in there, okay? So the people have their money there. So Beckworth lends her the investors money, and she says, okay, thank you, you know, I'm going to give you all the money, and she gives him a kickback on the $20,000 as well. So Beckworth really believes his ship has come in, that when he gets the Carnegie millions, that his bank will just be fabulously prosperous and they'll make a ton of money. Well, she's not done. So then she goes and visits a guy named Reverend Eaton. And Reverend Charles Eaton was the Reverend to the 1%, if you will, all right? He knows the Carnegies, he knows the Rockefellers, he knows everybody, okay? And she goes to see him and says, you know, I've got to tell you a story. And it's kind of a torrid story. And so she does. She tells him she's a legitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. And she says, and my problem is my father's not giving me money right now, so I need to get in touch with some bankers and give me a line of credit. So he does. He sets her up with a man named Newton in New York. And Newton says to Eaton, well, is she for real? And he goes, oh, yes, absolutely. You know, these other banks can vouch for it. And so what Cassie does is like checkers. She uses one bank against the other because she referenced the Oberlin Bank, the Wade Park Bank. And so Eaton now becomes this conduit into all this New York money. And she starts pulling loans everywhere. Everywhere. Now, initially, she would pay back the loans. You know, she'd take a loan, pay it back, but then she would stop paying. And so Beckworth gets very, very desperate because she basically breaks the Oberlin Bank. She takes all his money and then $100,000 of his own personal funds. And he goes to her house on Millionaire's Row with a gun. And he stands up and says, you got to pay me. And she says, oh, you know, I will. I just can't pay you right now. I'm a little short. And he stands up, takes the gun out, and points it to his own head and says, if you don't pay me, I'm going to shoot myself. And she says, well, if you shoot yourself, you won't get the money. So he doesn't. But, you know, anybody else would put it at her. But this is the early 20th century where decorum's everything. So she leaves the Oberlin Bank in the lurch, and she's constantly taking money from one bank to another, paying a little, moving on. And this has appeared when she's setting up these rooms in New York with all these diamonds. She's bringing other bankers in. They see the diamonds, they pay her money. And Cassie would have these bankers over to her own home, have all the servants there, have all her jewelry out, and people would say, again, they led on perceived wealth at this time. Oh, well, she's obviously got the money, she's good. And then she would make her own promissory notes. Here's a promissory note she made for $500,000. She said, oh, I have a promissory note drawn on this bank, even though it's a fraud. But this is something about Cassie, too. She understood very quickly how banking works. She wrote very sophisticated trust agreements that these 1% bankers took on and said, okay, this looks valid. So she was very, very smart in terms of just understanding how banking worked. And she also used their greed against them. They hit her with exorbitant interest rates. They thought, oh, this dumb woman, she doesn't know. And then she'd give them kickbacks. And she used that greed against them as well. But the Newton loan blows up. The Newton loan, she pulled $190,000 from this guy after Reverend Eaton vouched for her, and he didn't get paid. And Newton's not like these other bankers. He's like, where's the money? So he hires a private detective who unravels her trail and comes back to her and says, she owes everybody. She owes everybody millions. Newton goes right after her, gets the feds involved, and Cassie immediately vacates Cleveland and goes to New York, has a bunch of money with her, and her plan is, and it's a good one, is to go to Europe and disappear. Because guess what? Nobody's going to track you down in 1904 in Europe. This is where my book actually opens up, is when she's being chased around New York. So what happens is the Secret Service, Treasury agents start trailing her. They're trying to get a warrant for her. And she literally leads them on a trail from hotel to hotel where they keep chasing her. And when finally the warrant arrives, she's in bed at one of the hotels, and this big burly detective comes into her room with his mustache, and he says, I have this unpleasant duty to perform, madam, but you're under arrest. And she says, but I'm ill, what can I do? And she has her nurse there, and he says, well, okay, I understand. I will wait outside until you feel better. So he does. He waits outside because, again, this is the early 20th century where decorum has to be observed. And while he's outside, all these bankers start coming to see Cassie at the hotel, pleading that, she would pay them. And of course, she doesn't pay them at all. And when she's arrested in New York, she ends up in the Tombs, which is an awful place to be in prison. And they give her a choice of either staying there or going back to jail in Cleveland. And she chooses to go back to the jail in Cleveland. And even in the jail, she's given the best accommodations, because people can't quite believe that really she's not who she says she is. They can't believe that she is not this heiress with all this money and has all these funds and will pay everybody back. But she doesn't. And she goes back to Cleveland, and the trial of the century begins. Now, thousands of newspapers cover her and thousands of articles. It's just an amazing trial. And of course, the biggest moment is when Andrew Carnegie is subpoenaed to come there. So he comes to the courtroom. Cassie ignores him for a while, and he keeps staring at her, and then finally she looks up, and all the press is there, and they all say this moment where Carnegie looked at her. And Carnegie later wrote, he said, all those years I was trying to figure out what it was about me that allowed me to get all this money when others didn't. He said, when I looked at that woman, I knew what it was. He said it was avarice, just deadly greed, the ability to do anything to get your money. And basically he said, she's me. And Carnegie actually never had to even testify. They did a handwriting analysis, and after that, they let him go. Now, here's what gets interesting. Ira Reynolds testifies, and they say, did you give her your own money? And he says, yes, I did. And they said, why would you do that? He said, because I still believe she is who she says she is and will make good on this money. He can't believe that she is not this con artist. Beckworth, he dies. He dies a broken man before the trial, but he's indicted, along with Spears, as being in on this con, even though he wasn't. And he goes to visit Cassie at jail before the trial, and he says, with his wife, and he says, I believe you still are who you say you are, and that you will make good on this. And he leaves, and then he dies. He cannot believe that he had been duped to the point where he had destroyed his bank. His bank was closed. The reason they went after her is because the Oberlin Bank failed, and all those depositors lost all their money. If you ever see that movie, It's a Wonderful Life, you see the run on the bank, that's what happened here. So really, and in this whole crypto thing that's going on, it's when all those people invested in crypto lost their money, the government went after that guy, because that's the way it would work when middle class people really get hit. So Beckworth, though, even to his dying day, still believed that she was who she said she was. Now, what the government did on their case is they didn't cover all these loans. They ignored them. In fact, the banks wanted them to ignore them because they didn't want a run on their banks, because they didn't want to be associated with it. So all they did was they went after her for conspiracy to defraud a bank, the Oberlin Bank, basically passing a bad check. That's what they said. They said she was passing checks when she didn't have any money in the bank. And that was it. That was all they went after her for. And she's finally convicted. Now, on the day she's convicted, her hearing's so bad that the judge says, the jury finds you guilty, and she stumps and says, praise the Lord, I'm free. And her lawyer goes, no. And they had to take her all the way up to the judge so she could hear that she had been convicted. And of course, for her, she just claimed that this was all a setup and that she had been conned and she had been framed. But she does go to jail, where she dies very quickly, within 2 years. But She has the best jail cell in the penitentiary with a room with a view of the outside. And so I will read to you the very last paragraph of the book. Painting Cassie as a criminal is one way to look at it, but she did not exist in a vacuum. She was a product of her time, and that time was one that rewarded someone who was smart, inventive, aggressive, and able to break through class boundaries of education and gender to beat the men of the 1% at their own game. Andrew Carnegie knew her name and had to appear at her trial. He commented on how gullible the bankers had been to lend her money, but the old Scotsman understood ruthless intent, and he must have recognized that in the woman sitting across the courtroom. In the end, Cassie Chadwick reached up very far and ended up with millions. The truth is, Elizabeth Bigley came to the poker table with nothing. No chips, no backing, no heritage, an immigrant who left with the other players' wallets. That's a sign of either a brilliant woman or at least a brilliant con. Thank you. You're welcome. Oh, and everybody wants a buck, I will sign it for you, and I do take credit cards.